So, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the September 15th. No, what day is today?
It's that
Eighth.
kind of week.
Yeah, the 8th.
September 8th. Thank you. Welcome to the September 8th edition of Collect Our Cousins, engaging white people in the struggle for full democracy. I'm Karen Fleshman, founder of Collect Our Cousins and of Racy Conversations. I created this weekly live stream to help white Americans like me become more effective in our conversations with white people in our lives, to help us build an embodied anti-racist white culture. I'm featuring the people who inspire and teach me the most in how to do this work. White Americans, the battle for our democracy will not be won in courtrooms or in the streets. It must be won in our living rooms, at our neighborhood meetings, school board meetings, when we're talking with our friends. As an anti racist, collecting my cousins often falls to the end of my to do list. Oh, I'll get to that next month. But I want to urge you, if you're watching this show, to write a list of your friends and family you will collect this year. There are 21 million Americans, largely white, who believe Donald Trump is the legitimate president and that political violence may be necessary to restore him. And we are frontline in this battle, as well as winning over the white Americans who are neutral or somewhere in the middle. And as I say those words, I'm so grateful to our guests, Sara and Misasha. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm so excited for today.
Same here. It's great to reconnect with you and see you sort of in real life, live time, as opposed to just following the LinkedIn feeds and all the stuff that you've been up to.
Yes. So excited to be here, honestly. My kids went back to school yesterday, and I was like, and this might be the highlight of my week, as opposed to shoving my kids out of the car and being like, goodbye. So,
y'all, my kids both started new schools that are super far away. And it is so much to get them out the door and then riding the muni, they're riding the public bus, which is awesome, and also has there's just a variety of experiences riding the muni. So and I'm running for school board on top of everything else. So this has been a very interesting period in my life. But I'm so grateful to you for making time. And we have some great folks. We have David. Thank you for joining us. Hello. And Bridget, thank you for joining us. Naomi, oh my goodness, I'm so excited you're here. We got to get you on here. Okay, I'm reaching out. This is a great reminder. And Tracy Brown, yay, thank you for joining us. So would you like to introduce yourselves and share a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So Misasha and I, let's see, it's like the genesis. We are the biracial co-hosts of a platform called Dear White Women. We met 25 years ago in a half Asian People's Association meeting. We're both the daughter of a white parent and a Japanese immigrant parent each. And I mean, we have to tell the story that we both got up in the middle of the meeting because we disagreed with how they were positioning what it means to be biracial. These identity questions didn't sit right. And a handful of us got up in the meeting and sort of left. And Misasha and I met in the hallway right outside of the meeting. And we've been best friends ever since. And so, we've only lived in the same city 1 year after college. We've been long distance best friends. Thank goodness for technology in some ways. But over the years, conversations change, right? I mean, Misasha's always been a great fashion tip person for me, right? But conversations shift from your 20s into your 30s. And then we both got married and then we had children and our conversation shifted to different ones, right? I have 2 girls with a white Canadian husband and my girls present as white despite being, a quarter Japanese and half Canadian. And Misasha married a Black man and has kids who are very multiracial, who are Black, Japanese, and white, but the world sees as Black. And so we were having these best friend conversations behind the scenes. And then yet, because we're biracial, we were also floating in circles of a lot of white women and realized people weren't talking about the hopes, dreams, and fears in the same way that we had for our kids. And so we thought, well, let's bring these conversations to a broader audience, and then launched the Dear White Women podcast 3.5 years ago, weekly since then. And I don't think we'll run out of things to talk about. As you know, there's a lot in this space. High five. And then we published a book. So Misasha, I don't know if you want to take the book part.
Which if you have
look at you yes, that's the
fangirl.
Yeah, so so I want to go back to something that Sara said, because she was talking about floating in circles of white women. And I think what's been really important for us that we've brought to the platform is that we've sort of discovered three things about those circles, or three sort of different areas that we talk about on the podcast. Like, one is we know what's being said in those circles. Two is we know what's not being said in those circles, as Sara was referencing. And three, we know what's being said in those circles when people believe that there's no one of color in that space. And I think that three part is the part that doesn't get said out loud a lot. And that's what we try and infuse into the podcast when we're thinking about how we structure episodes. What do we want people to take away? And we really lean into the practical. And the book is sort of an offshoot of the podcast in that way, because, to talk about the book a little bit, we have to talk about when we started writing that book. And we started writing it during the COVID shutdown, really. So, we had a little bit of stuff on our plate. Like, we were homeschooling kids suddenly. Like, I was a pretty terrible, as I found out, kindergarten and second grade teacher. I was an equally miserable and terrible first and third grade teacher. We'll just put that to the side for a second.
And bitter wife.
Yeah, it was a hot mess. Okay. So Sara asked me, in the midst of all of this, because we're still recording the podcast, we're still trying
why the F are we doing this now? Basically was the question.
Yeah. And so it's like one of those speed round things where it's like, someone asks you a question and you say the first thing that comes to your mind. And I remember I'm driving, I don't know, somewhere to do something, probably go into a grocery store for 5 seconds. And I said to her the first thing that came to my mind, which is my truth to this day. And I said, I'm trying to save my kids' lives. And so that really is why, and Sara's like, all right, to her credit, I'm in. So we wrote the book in the time period between the 2020 election and the January 6th insurrection. So also just a few things were happening.
I love Karen's look
in that time. So that really also influenced the book. And the conclusion talks about the January 6th insurrection, because we needed that to be part of the book. But the book is structured like I mentioned, it's sort of an offshoot of the podcast. So it's structured in 3 sections: being white in America, being Black in America, and being a non-Black person of color in America. So we really lean into our podcast formula, or overarching platform formula, which is listen, learn, and act. So each section has subchapters or chapters where we go into really like pain points or questions that we've been asked along the way. Like, well, I don't have white privilege, right? Is the topic of one of the being white in America, or the extra stuff Black women go through is one of the chapters in being Black in America. And we break each chapter up into listen, where we share personal narratives. Sometimes they're personal to us, sometimes they're personal to others that we've talked to. Then learn, where we talk about the history that you probably didn't learn in school, that we're still apparently not teaching in schools in a lot of places. And then we move into the practical. Like, so now that you've heard this narrative, you understand the history and why this is the way it is. What are we all going to do about that? And so that's why I love this opportunity to have this conversation, because you're also trying to answer that question. Like, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And I think it's not enough to have the listen and learn, which we've had for so long. We need that act piece, right?
Yes.
And so that was what brought the book on. We called it Dear White Women, Let's Get Uncomfortable Talking About Racism, because as people close to us pointed out, no one's ever comfortable talking about racism, regardless of who you are. And so we wanted to get that conversation out there and to reach all of the people who may not be podcast listeners, but are still really needed in this conversation.
Thank you so much for that. And as you were talking, I was thinking about someone tweeted, when a Black person gets killed by the cops, Black people protest and white people join a book club. And how we have to move beyond sitting in our living room in our comfort, reading about things and actually engaging in the world to change things. And that's where things can get extremely uncomfortable, and white people can be very reluctant to engage. Naomi says, I love your backstory and I relate to the shade of being in spaces that get being multi-ethnic all wrong.
I think I even got being multi-ethnic not all wrong, but I had an evolution.
Mm,
For growing up, I was half Japanese, half white.
mhm,
And it was in the wake of the Atlanta spa shootings
mm,
that a white man in our community who I'd had racial conversations with called and said, like, look, I didn't think I mean, I've had to call Black friends, but never thought I'd have to call you as an Asian woman to see how
mm,
you're doing today. And in that moment, like, all of a sudden, I had spent the last sort of 15 years living in very heavily white communities and areas of the country compared to the first half of my life, which was very metropolitan under my Japanese mom's roof, like big cities in Asia, that sort of stuff. And my identities came colliding. And a friend and sort of colleague in the work of ours, Jerry Wan, who runs Dear Asian Americans, basically said to us, I think Misasha and I were on a joint call, and he's like, you're not half of either experience. You fully understand what it's like. Like, you are both. And I switched my languaging around that time to be like, I'm biracial. I'm not half, I'm biracial. I understand the nuances of both cultures, but have a different lens because I have I don't quite fit in everywhere. So I can really feel like I can create my own narrative and understanding of it and explain it in a different way to people.
I everything you're saying, like the people, biracial people play such an important role in advancing this conversation. When I think about Jay Smooth, when I think about Alicia Keys, I mean, so many people whose voices are so nuanced and empathetic. Adrienne Marie Brown, able to hold so much in their container, and to also compellingly explain things in a way that does not alienate, which I think is a big part of the equation.
I think that's been a large part of our work and our tone setting, actually, because I think we realized quickly, and especially I have a background in positive psychology, and I feel like human thriving is a really core part, like what makes people tick is a really core part of my curiosity and my interests. And knowing that, like you said, so many white people get stuck on this getting themselves uncomfortable. I felt like it was our privilege to be able to like communicate with people using our identities and using our understanding of the white spaces, and sort of saying, look, I understand that, for example, sometimes action feels like it's going to be terrifying. Like you mentioned, Karen, a Black person gets killed and then like Black people are protesting and white people join a book club, right? I mean, it's sort of tongue in cheek, but we realize that it doesn't have to be showing up. Like, there's so many different ways to make change. And we envision being part of anti-racism sometimes. A lot of white people envision it as being like on the front lines, using their body, really getting like panicky levels of uncomfortable. But it could be as simple as your Thanksgiving table and your uncle shows up and makes an absolutely inappropriate joke or comment, and you immediately say, what do you mean by that? And you hold the line of that conversation, and it changes the entire dynamic of your kitchen table. Everyone at the table understands where your line is, and you enter into different conversations. So it can start, or it can exist in those fears as well, but you have to start like speaking up in those little ways too. Like, you have to do something. You have to commit to those things, not just talking about it amongst like-minded people.
Yes, that is. I think there is definitely, when I started in my anti-racist journey and people were like, oh, white affinity space is really important. I was like, white affinity space? Why would I want to spend any time with white people? Like, I'm trying to distance myself from white people. And then as I've evolved and matured, I'm like, oh, this is why white affinity space is important, because there are things that we do need to hash through with each other so that we are not causing harm in doing it in a integrated multiracial space. But we can't get stuck just being in the white affinity space either. Then we need to emerge and like start engaging other white people and bringing them into the fold. What was I was going to, so as you started to do this, what was your interaction like in these all white social circles that you were participating in, as you started to say, well, what do you mean by that? What happened in those social circles?
I'd say for me, one of the first times I faced this like realization about one of the book clubs, ironically, that I was in, and we were having conversations about, and I wish I remember, it would make a much better story if I remember which book it was. I feel like saying it was one of Ta-Nehisi Coates' books, but we were leading this conversation and we were starting to talk about it. And someone goes, the majority of people didn't finish the book written by a Black man about racial justice, and said, but I'm kind of tired of talking about this. Aren't we done talking about racism? And I get it. I mean, I think after 2.5 years of pandemic, everybody's friggin' tired. Like, right? We like humanity is kind of tired right now. But I think we just asked this of Kamau Bell when we got to interview him, and he's like, "Are you more tired than Harriet Tubman? Like, are you more?" Like,
such a great answer,
right? I was like, that was excellent. But again, that sense of empathy. You know, science shows that we don't. It's harder for us to empathize with people who we see as different than us. Like scientifically, we tend to be drawn to people who are like us because it's easy. Like biologically, it's just over and over again. We're surrounded by people who are just like us. And so then having empathy for someone who's in a perceived like not like us group has to be a really conscious effort. And I realize that that's where so many of us who are in silos or who are just in survival mode in society don't have that natural capacity to understand that other people have their own struggles too, and that capacity to remove themselves from their lives, to have empathy. It's all just through their own lens. So I think part of the work has to be helping white people remove themselves from perfectionism, remove themselves from capital, like all of these pressures that they are under too, and realize that we are all tired. Chances are people are more tired than you are, who actually have to live under the oppression even more than you do.
Yeah, I would say it's a little different for me because in the circles that I'm in, people know that my husband is Black, that, you know, my kids are Black. And so I feel like sometimes people try and skirt the issue, or we have these really awkward conversations where I'm like, you can say Black, you know, you don't have to try and figure out what the word is. They're Black. My husband is Black. It's not a bad word. And I will say that the conversations around a lot of this, what I have seen and what I've been trying to talk about is when we are having these conversations, or when white people are having these conversations and they really center themselves in the conversation, and then it becomes this weird conversation. And I'll give you an example. So I was at Podcast Movement speaking on the Asian American experience on that panel with Jerry Wan, who Sarah had mentioned. And I was with another panelist, Patrick. And so we were walking around this giant space, and he runs into this white man that he had seen the night before and had drinks with or whatever. And right before that, we're talking about our tagline for the podcast, which is, we help white women use their privilege to uproot systemic racism without centering themselves in the process. And so I'm literally saying these words to Patrick. This guy walks up, he's, you know, they're talking, and then he introduces me. He says, "Oh, what do you do?" I said, "So I have this podcast called Dear White Women," you know, and given the tagline, he's like, "Oh, that's really good work. That's, I think that's, you know, that's so admirable that you're doing the work." And I feel like in that moment, right, he's already distancing himself from this. So then he goes on and he says, you know, "I've lived abroad a lot." And I was like, okay, I don't know where this conversation is going. It's like, I met my wife in Cambodia when I was living there. I'm like, okay, now this conversation could be getting really weird. And so he starts talking about how he lived in Africa. And then he says something like, "Oh, you know, it's really interesting to me that I face sort of less racism in Africa than I did in Cambodia. And at this point, Patrick and I are just like frozen, like deer in the headlights, like what is happening? He's like, because, you know, given the history of Black Americans and the oppression and all of, you know, the struggle that they've had to endure in the US, I would have thought that I would have been treated way worse in Ghana, I guess, where he had lived, you know, where because they have this, you know, they are the ancestors. And at this point, Patrick and I were like, okay, so this conversation can go one of two ways. One, we can be like, hi, do you have 45 minutes in which we can start deconstructing everything that is sort of that's problematic with what you said, because there's so many places we don't know where to start. The second option was to walk away. And in that moment, we were like, we're going to walk away. But Patrick, you know, made some excuse, and then the guy said again, like, oh, you know, it's so important that you're doing this work. And I said to him, we all need to be doing this work. It's really important that we all do this work. And I think that there's both the combination of centering and then assuming that this is someone else's work that happens in a lot of these conversations. And that's, I think, what I've been trying to tell people. It's not just for people who are affected by racism, because we all are, right? We all are. We have that identity. Sarah and I talk a lot about how being white is a race, right? It is not, we are not racist if we call you white women, because that's actually what you are. And I think we have not been taught to own that, right? We have not, because it's been the dominant narrative. White has been sort of the default, right? So we don't talk about whiteness. And so I think the more that we talk about whiteness in these spaces, the more that we can get to this, we all actually have a role to play here. But those are sort of the two dynamics that I've seen.
I would also add, and by the way, my dog, who apparently is aging and has some sort of sleep apnea, is snoring in the background. So if there's any odd noises, I apologize. It's the dog on the mic, not me. But I think one of the things that is important about this work, and Karen, you were saying, we have to get more and more people to have these conversations too. If we realize that we now live in a country where the children are learning wildly different things in school, depending on what state you're in, right? My kids are talking in Colorado about their pronouns. They're talking about the true history of Thanksgiving. Like, they're learning in a very different public school system than the kids in Florida, whose kids can maybe not acknowledge that their parents are gay. Like, they can't even talk about their trips or how they process their two dads or whatever, right? And so and I would argue, at least based on the media and everything that I've seen that gets traction, the angry people get the attention. And so we are hearing a lot of hate, a lot of anger, and coming from people who want kids to learn stuff like in Florida, not like in Colorado. And so if people who think that it's who are in the love category, if you will, who are in this idea of deconstructing these powers of oppression, and in this idea that we can all live a better life than what we have in America right now by being kinder to one another, by like just acknowledging the humanity of all of us, we need to get even louder than the haters. I think for so long we've been like, no, this is just the default. This is the right way to be. So we're not going to get in anybody's face. We don't need to talk about it. It's so obvious that the truth is we're all one of 7.8 billion people on the planet or whatever, right? But no, like, we have to actually make the noise, or else society is tipping in the direction of the squeaky wheel. And that's right now the haters.
Yes. And they are highly organized. They had a whole convention this summer to teach white women how to run for school board, how to get into these positions. And this is not the first time. I mean, from the advent of universal public education in this country, the Ku Klux Klan organized around making education their policy platform and getting their members on school boards. And then the United Daughters of the Confederacy getting textbooks written that told all these lies. I mean, they have always approached the public education system in this country as a way to indoctrinate children into white supremacy, which is why we wind up learning all these lies. In my high school in Colorado, we were always state football champions and state basketball champions. And the coaches were the social studies and history teachers because those are the quote easy subjects, right? I could go on and on about this topic, but you are so on point. This is why I'm running for school board. And I also want to bring into the conversation what my mentor, Sweetwater Nanak, who is a Tlingit Native Alaskan woman, taught me. She's the founder of Idle No More Washington, amazing workshop facilitator, amazing educator. And she taught me that the reason why white activism is so ineffective is because it's driven by fear and anger. And she said, you can't make change with fear and anger. The reason why Native activism is so effective is because it's rooted in spirit and love. And I try to always remember that as I engage in activism, that I am doing this. I come in a spirit of love. I'm coming here to construct, to make something beautiful and to create, not to destroy. And I think that is a very important energetic shift that we need to have in this conversation, that those of us who love humanity, we that's what's motivating us to want to educate our kids to love and value all humanity. It's not because it's not driven out of hate or fear or anger. It's driven out of love. What was I wanted to so tell me about how white women respond to you. Do you have fans who listen to every word you say? Are they angry? What happens in these conversations?
I'd say there's a spectrum. I will say we have fans who are very supportive. We have a book club that is made up of sort of our biggest fans, where we can really get deep into topics that we sort of touch on the podcast and in the book. I will say, like I mentioned earlier, that there are people who are well, I should back up and say, when you name something "Dear White Women," people feel a way about that, right? Whether no one's not going to just be ambivalent towards that. People have strong opinions. And, some of the strong opinions we've heard on sort of the non-supportive side have been around, like I mentioned, calling us racist for calling white women white, and very angry that they feel like we're singling out a specific group of people, and that also to lump all white women together is not fair, because they voted for whomever and they did whatever, and it ignores, right, the systemic nature and and how white supremacy is really grounded into the bedrock of everything that has sort of been structured out in this country. So it comes from a place of ignorance a lot of times, and I'm not saying ignorance as a hurtful thing or as meant to be necessarily a bad thing. I think going back to what we were taught in school, right, and growing up in California, for example, we have every fourth grader learns about the missions, right? I for sure did not learn. The Spanish, what I learned was the Spanish came in and built these great missions, and sort of created this whole ecosystem, right? And let's just shove all the Native American stories to the side, because that wasn't part of the story that they wanted to tell. And so I think that there's a lot of unlearning that has to happen, and then relearning. And that is tough. I think that's tough. So I think there are people who are very hesitant about that, because that goes against sort of these ideals that are, upheld, that white supremacy needs, right? Like perfectionism and staying in line and, following the path, especially if it's working out for you, right? Then you don't rock the boat, right? So yes. And I think that to get people, we've seen though, people start asking questions. We always want people to ask why. And, we talk about this a lot. Like the answer I hate the most is because it's always been that way. Because sure, right, it might have, but is that the right way? And so when we start to get people asking questions, that's when I think we start to sort of convert people, for lack of a better word, or, get them to start thinking like, hey, maybe what I learned in school was not actually the full truth or even the truth at all. And if that's not true, what else isn't true? Or what else have I taken for granted about my identity, my role in this that might not be the case?
And I think you're right. The feedback I've been hearing, because I've done sort of workshops around the book with book clubs of predominantly white women. And a lot of them say, man, like, I wish you didn't call yourselves Dear White Women. Like, it's so different. Like, the impression I get from that is so different once I get to know your work. And I think like there's a beauty in that where I'm like, okay, cool. Like, actually, that challenges you right from the start to not take things at face value, to dig in and learn a little bit more. And I think for those who make the effort to open the book, to listen to the show, are very pleasantly surprised, because we have that listen, learn, and act, that we're in it together approach of let's learn, let's make a difference. Like, you're not necessarily at fault for not knowing all of this until this point, because we were not taught in schools. Communities are segregated. You really may not have talked to enough Black friends about what their real life is like,
And all by design.
It's all by design. But now that you know, and you're here at the table, it is your responsibility. We are responsible for each other. And so let's get on with it. Let's go. And I think for those who sort of see the name and go, this is another whatever angry person, like, people don't even assume, like, I think we've had a couple of live events where people are like, I didn't expect you two to look the way you do, having a platform like Dear White Women. Like, you're not Black. Like, we're like, nope, no, we're not. And so I think that falls under the category of people who are prioritizing their comfort. They get uncomfortable at the name Dear White Women, that makes them uncomfortable, and they look away. And that is, again, a challenge that we need people to face and step over and continue the work, because it's just the beginning of getting uncomfortable and doing it anyway.
Yes. And I would like to highlight this word. You really are very dear to white women in this book. Dear. That that your approach is very holding us with a lot of love and accountability. It's not this you are terrible people, blah, blah, blah kind of tone. It's very welcoming.
Yeah, I think I made the mistake of saying it on some TV interview. I'm like, it's like a love letter to white women. And I was like, instantly, like, that sounds so
I'm
weird.
not 100%.
No, it was not that. But
I think that, when I was talking about writing this book was, for me, trying to save my kids' lives. One of the things that I kept in mind while we were writing this book, and that Sarah and I talk about, is that, when our kids leave our houses, right, I can't protect them, right? When my boys walk out the door, and I have my older son is now right at the cusp of not being considered cute anymore, right? And for Black boys, that goes to aggressive, right? A threat. And so the minute he walks out of our doors, he's in everyone else's hands, right? And if we are isolating people or pushing them out of the conversation, those hands aren't going to catch him, right? And I need those hands to catch him and hold him and be the protectors for him where I cannot be, because it is a fact that, or it will be a reality that both of my boys will be called the N-word at some point, right? And I'm just hoping that they can make it, to my oldest will turn 10 in a couple of weeks. Like, I'm hoping that maybe he can make it to 11, maybe he can make it to 12. And it's really a heartbreaking thing, right? Because there's no other word in the English language that is as hurtful as that, right? And because of the history of that word. And that's why we spent a whole chapter in the book talking about the history of that word, so people really understand why, if you're not Black, you're not using that word, period. And but I think that in order to save my kids, in order to save kids who look like them, or who are also, targets of racism, of discrimination in that way, we have to get everyone in there, because we have to get people to be those upstanders, right? To intervene if it's possible, to stop what happens, because they know the history and they know that this is going to go down this way. When my boys might not be able to do that for themselves, right? Or kids like them. Because I think we think about, when we were talking earlier, we think about that creation, right, of things, and we want to focus on the creation. And I think if we have not been able to really create or visualize what that better world looks like, right? But that world is tied to our kids directly. And I think the more that we can protect our kids, the more that we can get to that creation of that better world. So that is what I think really pushes and drives, at least me, I think both of us, in this work.
With an asterisk, because when you said protect our kids, I instantly pictured white people being like, that's why I don't want to make them uncomfortable. We're not talking about protecting them from the truth. We're talking about protecting their lives, protecting and honoring that they are fully capable of understanding our history and understanding power dynamics and understanding right and wrong. I think, Misasha, you often say that when you're in classrooms talking to kids about justice, like you do this work in classrooms, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, my second grader last year for Black History Month, he was like, I'd like you to read a kid's book about systemic racism to my class. And I was like, all right, so this may be the last book that I ever read in this school, because they might be like, not that mom, she's out. But to everyone's credit, I read it in my second graders class. I read it in my fourth graders class. And those kids, and that school, my kids are the only Black kids in their class, right? And it's sort of a mix of white and Asian kids otherwise. And those kids asked great questions. And no one felt a way about this discussion of systemic racism. Like no white kid, from what I understood, and I talked to the teachers afterwards, felt personally responsible for this, right? Like none of them felt this is I did this. But I think what they focused on is what I can do going forward, right? And that, I think that and I have had white parents say directly to me, I don't want to have that conversation with my kid about race because I'm afraid that it's going to traumatize them. And that, I think it's really important to recognize that is white privilege right there, right? The ability to have a choice, right? Whether you have that conversation, because we have that conversation in my house a lot because it's about survival. And I think that if we have that conversation in every house, it becomes about uplifting all of us, right? Because we are all crucial for each other's survival. And so I think the more that we can see those links and those ties, and like Sarah was saying, these kids, they don't feel that way. Their parents might feel that way, and then they project that onto the kids, right? But those kids do not. And second graders are my absolute favorite now, because I had one kid ask me, well, why am I called white if my skin color is pink? And I was like, great question. Thank you for asking, because that's the level that they want to, because they see color. They understand this, and they have great questions. And asking that question at 7 years old means that at 8 years old, you're prepared to understand so much more. And at 13, you're challenging concepts that your parents have, or maybe even at 8. And you're creating this world, right, that we want for our kids. And I think that's so powerful.
I love, love, love everything you're saying. And I practice this with my kids. So I'm the mother of biracial Japanese white children. And I'm also adopted. And so my parents told me from the time I could talk, Karen, you're adopted. There's no stigma. We love you. We worked, we did everything we could in order to be able to adopt you. And if you want to find your biological parents, that's fine. We totally understand that. Like, it was full disclosure about everything. So I never grew up feeling some kind of way about being adopted, nor was there this big reveal, oh, you're adopted, and all the crisis that could have provoked, right? So I took the same approach to talking about racism. We started talking about racism from the time my kids could talk. So it was never like, oh, there's this horrible thing called racism, and now I'm going to protect you from it. And what I found is that kids are so resilient and they're so justice oriented, and their view of the world is so pure. So if you can help them frame what they are experiencing, yeah, they're total. It doesn't cause any harm. What causes harm is to not give them all this context and history, and then something happens later on in life, and they're totally shocked when they learn, oh, racism is at the heart of this. Um,
I agree with that. Plus, I think you're validating their gut feel, right? Like you can see subtle dynamics, and kids are, I mean, I don't know about all of your kids out there listening to this, right? But my
yeah,
kids, I mean, they can tell if I'm trying to say, wow, you did a great job clearing your dishes. And my other kids, like, you're saying that because I didn't do a great job doing it. And you're trying to psych me out. And I'm like, oh man, I was totally called on my BS parenting technique. Like, okay, noted, right? Kids get a sense of what's really happening. And if you can explain for them that, yes, your gut instinct is right, people are being treated differently. You know, here's potential explanations for why. Here's our history. Not only does that give them more confidence in trusting their instinct, but I think then it prepares them for when they're friends with people of all different colors and backgrounds and genders, like to understand why maybe if they're driving a car recklessly, they get pulled over, but their Black friend is in the car, like why they might want to actually behave differently because of the historic risk, right? Like why they might not run around with guns, like pretend guns, like, you know, and play hide and seek in the neighborhood if their friends are of color. Like, I think kids will then see that and a way to look out for each other in a better way, as opposed to being like, that's weird, I don't understand why they can't do it, and not understand that it's really a matter of safety for their friends.
Yes, yes. Oh my gosh, we are coming to the close of our time together. This has been such an incredible conversation. Naomi says being multi-ethnic, however, on its own does not necessarily make one more aware or involved. That is an assumption people can make that is dangerous because it can downplay the historical systemic piece. My parents, Ecuadorian mother and white Jewish American father, were intentional in discussing identity, inequity, and social change with my brother and me. That intentionality must happen. Yes, 100%. And I urge, especially white parents of biracial children, to do our own work so that we're not causing harm to our kids and are capable of having these conversations with our kids from an early age. And she also says it is heartbreaking and devastating and infuriating. White folks, or those presumed to be white, ought not to be safer in the world on the basis of a cruel lie created to justify systemic racism, white supremacy, and anti-Blackness. Thank you, Naomi. I want to ask two questions to round out our conversation. Number one, is there some book or resource that you would highly recommend to white women beyond your book, like something that you read that you were like, wow, I wish more white women knew this?
You know, I think it's a new book. And I just mentioned that it's Do the Work. It's a workbook by Kamau Bell and Kate Schatz. And it's the reason I recommend it is because I think we're hit with the slew of theoretical books on anti-racism already. We wanted to be one of the first to fill that gap on practical anti-racism. And I think their workbook is another very, very practical, funny, approachable guide to actually getting in there and doing the work and challenging yourself. And I think that's the space we need to be living in right now.
Awesome.
And I would say the sum of us, because I think, that book in a way where people are like, I don't understand how we got here, right? I don't believe systemic racism exists. The fact that she starts the book with the pool example, which I just talked about on LinkedIn, but I think that one example sort of gets people to understand in a way that it's very hard to understand, systemic racism otherwise throughout the decades. So and it's so accessible, even though it's a book largely about economics and politics. That's one of my favorites of all time.
Awesome. In closing, if you could wave a magic wand and get white women to stop doing something or start doing something, what would it be and why?
I need a minute to think. Misasha, you might have to go. There's so many. How do you narrow it down to one?
Well, you can do a multi-part answer. This is a yes and answer too. Don't feel like it has to be just one.
I think one of the biggest things that I hope for white women, and maybe I'm talking about a certain socioeconomic bracket, certain education level women, but like, get the hell out of keeping up with the Joneses syndrome. Get out of this mode of like capitalism at all costs. Understand the science that after you make a certain amount of money, no extra money is going to make you happier. So let's enjoy our life. Let's enjoy our humanity. Let's be real and stop with this flashy peacock stuff. Because once you get rid of that, you can really focus on the values and the importance and how interconnected we really are. So that's one of the places I'd say.
I would say there's sort of a two-part or like connected thing. Like one is to really stop centering yourselves in these conversations. And I think it's really hard to do because I think that if you're part of the dominant narrative, everything is centered around you, right, to begin with. So that's a learned thing, and it's very hard to unlearn that. So I understand that will take a lot of time, and a lot of it comes from listening and not immediately thinking, well, but that I feel like is the first thing that you want to consciously think and sit with that for a minute before you open your mouth to say, well, but whatever. And the second part is kind of along what we were talking about, prioritizing comfort, right? I think that we know, right? And I keep thinking back to the conversation, Sarah, we had with the opt-in, right? And about, I was a fitness instructor for a number of years. I have seen white women do incredibly hard things over and over to the point where I'm like, I wouldn't even do that. I don't know why you're holding that plank for 57 minutes, right? So clearly we don't always prioritize comfort, right? And I'm talking to white women here, like sometimes I know you can do hard things. And it's really from discomfort that we grow, right? Because back to that plank example, right? You start holding planks for longer. I hate planks, so I'm not ever doing this, but you hold them for longer, you get uncomfortable so you can get stronger, right? And I think we have to think about this work in the same way, right? It will be uncomfortable and it may never get comfortable. Like, I'm sure holding a plank for 27 minutes is not comfortable either. But it is so worth it, right? Because it is transformative, not only for you, but it's for everyone, right? Everyone. And so I think that those are the two things that I would say.
I love it. I love it. How can people find you and follow your work?
All of our information is on our website, dearwhitewomen.com. Our podcast, like I said, 3.5 years in, is on all the major platforms except for Spotify. And our book is available. You can get it from our website, but at any retail bookstore near you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. This was so awesome. Thank you for everybody who tuned in. Please join us next week, which is September 15th. Where our guests are Tracy J. and Michelle Emmanuel. Sara Misasha, thank you so much for coming on the show. And this was such an amazing conversation. And keep out there, keep reaching and teaching my white sisters. And my white sisters, please follow Sara and Misasha.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, this was so great.
Yay. Okay, bye everybody. Until next week.